Welcome back to another one of your flipped lectures. Today we're going to continue our discussion of the 1920s. When we talk about the Roaring Twenties, something that we often do not talk about is the fact that the 1920s really roared mostly with conflicts. When we talk about these conflicts, there's a number of things. There's the intellectual lost generation versus the common man, science and religion, the urban population versus the rural population, the new moderns and the old traditionalists. And so there's a lot of battle lines that are going to be drawn as these changes happen in the 1920s. And like today, the issues of science and religion were prevalent in American culture. In 1925, the controversy over evolution erupted in what was known as the Scopes monkey trial, where in Tennessee, a teacher called John Scopes was put on trial for teaching evolution in violation of a Tennessee law that basically banned the teaching of Charles Darwin's theories. And so this trial, even though it was more of a spectacle, meant to kind of draw attention to the town, it kind of creates this national controversy between fundamentalists and modernists, those who believe in Darwin's evolution and those who believe in creationism. Two of the most famous lawyers of the day, William Jennings Bryan, shown in the picture, and Clarence Darrow, the most famous defense attorney, are going to argue this case. But kind of the overall picture of this is that Americans are fighting over new ideas about science and old ideas about traditional religion. Another major conflict comes down along racial ethnic lines. And when we talk about the 1920s, we talk about kind of how blacks in America, especially in cities, experience a lot of success in the American mainstream. In Harlem, there's the Harlem Renaissance. In Tulsa, Oklahoma, there's Black Wall Street, kind of a very wealthy area that blacks are living in. There's jazz, literature, education, business, and in a lot of cases, that jazz and literature is entering the mainstream. And so rising in opposition to all these changes, and also the patterns of immigration that we've talked about, is the Ku Klux Klan. And this Ku Klux Klan is going to be different. It's going to be an urban Klan, kind of based in urban areas, cities, not just kind of the rural South that it had during Reconstruction. And they're going to paint themselves as the defenders of traditional morality and traditional American values. They're going to support Prohibition, and they're going to kind of take advantage of racial competition in the cities, the rise of black culture, as well as anti-Catholic, Jewish, and immigrant sentiment in the United States. And so the Ku Klux Klan is going to have a lot of power during this era, especially in the Midwest. They're going to have a march on Washington during the 1920s, and so this is going to show us that although there are a lot of changes taking place, there's also a lot of resistance to that change in the United States. Another huge battle line that's drawn is about immigration, and so in this case, kind of not many things change. But in 1924, the National Origins Act is passed, which actually creates something called the quota system. That's going to limit the number of immigrants that are able to come in from certain countries, limited to 3% of the total population of that ethnicity in the United States at the time. And the overall goal of this is simply to limit immigrations from Asia, South and Eastern Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. The whole goal of this is to reduce immigration. They're going to basically ban Japanese immigration. There's going to be a Red Scare, the fear that communists would immigrate to the United States. Also kind of the idea of wanting to create a national American identity, and that new immigrants would hurt the development of that identity, and then also kind of the fear about the economic impact of immigration. So kind of as we can see this year, the fight over immigration in the United States has been going on since the very beginning. And so here's a political cartoon that shows Uncle Sam preventing all the immigrants who want to come to the United States from getting in with that 3% quota system. In terms of like morality also, the Jazz Age is going to kind of rub up against traditionalist. This is really also a city versus rural type of idea. That kind of the new morality and the new culture of the cities is going to clash with the more traditional rural, country, small town American culture. There's going to be a generational gap, as we talked about with the lost generation, that kind of the youth is going to ultimately reject these traditions and are going to seek to establish their own. That idea of modernity is going to separate these two generations. And then ultimately kind of the way that this plays out, the most kind of easy to see, the best example, is in Prohibition in the 1920s. In that Prohibition, the ban of alcohol in the United States comes from a place of morality. There was a belief among progressives, the Ku Klux Klan, other defenders of traditional morality, that alcohol in the cities, especially, led to domestic violence, unemployment, and poverty. There was an idea that Catholics, urban people, immigrants, basically had a problem with alcohol and that this was causing a national crime and public health crisis. And so in January of 1920, the 18th Amendment to the Constitution, so they actually passed a constitutional amendment to do this, is going to ban the sale of alcohol in the United States. And so the Volstead Act was a follow-up law that actually made the U.S. Treasury have the power to enforce prohibition. And so throughout the 1920s, alcohol is actually going to be illegal in the United States, which is kind of interesting if you think about it, kind of all of the culture of the 1920s. But again, just because something's illegal doesn't mean that people aren't going to do it. And Prohibition is going to last all the way till 1933 and the passage of the 21st Amendment repealing the 18th. And so again, kind of this Prohibition movement is a popular movement. The women's Christian temperance movement, progressives, all sorts of people threw in for the idea that banning alcohol in the United States would help America return to a state of morality and would improve the public health. But Prohibition wasn't really popular with everyone. While the Treasury Department was capturing and throwing out bootleg liquor, there were millions of Americans who were working actively to try to get it repealed. And those who couldn't get the booze illegally themselves would go to places like speakeasies, kind of illegal bars where you would go in and it was all kind of secretive, but you could purchase alcohol. And so the good times of the 1920s were definitely not slowed down by Prohibition very much. But one of the unintended consequences of Prohibition is the rise of organized crime and bootleggers. Especially Chicago's Al Capone began to create massive fortunes in crime networks based on the smuggling and sale and sometimes creation of alcohol to sell during Prohibition. Kind of another major change during the 1920s is going to happen in the African American community. And as we've looked at already, racism is very prevalent in the United States during this time. Kind of Amos and Andy, blackface, the Ku Klux Klan. There's going to be kind of a lot of things working against blacks in the United States in the 1920s. But the Great Migration had brought large communities of these people from the South into northern cities. And out of this came something called the Harlem Renaissance, in which a unique African-American culture gets created with its own music, literature, philosophy, and education systems that is going to really advance the interests of African-Americans in the 1920s. And W.E.B. Du Bois is one of the major voices of this period. And he talks about the idea of double consciousness, that basically Negroes in America, and that's what he calls himself, lives in a world that yields no true self-consciousness, but only lets him see himself through the revelation of the other world. It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body. And so kind of W.B. Du Bois talked about this idea that African Americans had kind of this situation where they didn't have their own unique culture, and that they were judged consistently against kind of the white European culture of the day, and they were often the object of kind of racism and pity. And so he believed that black people not only had to think about themselves in developing their own identity, but also had to worry about how the rest of American society would view them. And so W.B. Du Bois was one of the major pushers for this idea of Harlem Renaissance, to try to attain a self-conscious manhood and to merge that double self into a better and truer oneself, an identity for Negroes in the 1920s. And kind of this movement is going to turn into the Harlem Renaissance. And the Harlem Renaissance is going to be characterized by development of unique music, like jazz. And the very famous Duke Ellington is a great example of this music. And Negro music would break kind of the color barrier and would end up kind of bringing this Harlem Renaissance culture all over the United States to both black and white audiences. In literature, Langston Hughes and other poets are going to start publishing books, poems, philosophy, and all sorts of other stuff that is going to give this era of history in this community a particular voice that is going to help them develop throughout the 1920s. And ultimately, this idea called the New Negro crops up. And the goal of the New Negro is to overcome racism. But the big question is, like, how do you overcome racism? And for the Harlem Renaissance, the New Negro movement is about racial pride. It's about changing the images of blacks in the United States from those racial stereotypes into kind of the belief that the blacks are just as intelligent, talented as white Americans and other Americans. And so because as the New Negro movement focused on education in schools, it focused on literature, arts and music, political and social philosophy and commentary. And this New Negro movement is going to go a long way during the 1920s to kind of advancing the ideas that are eventually going to turn into the civil rights movements of the 1950s and 60s. But not all Americans are really going to accept this idea of the New Negro. Racism is going to be very prevalent in the 1920s. It's going to continue into the 1930s. And in reality, legal protections for African Americans in the United States really aren't going to exist until the 1950s and 60s because the 14th Amendment is simply not going to be enforced. But during the Harlem Renaissance, this community refuses to accept that they are second-class citizens without their own culture. And ultimately, kind of we can say this about the 1920s. The 20s are going to roar, but at a cost. We talked about the economics, and all of the problems of the Roaring '20s are really going to kind of focus in on the economic bubble that is created. There is overproduction, just simply too much stuff is being made. And so eventually workers are going to be laid off as production is going to slow. Also, this idea of too much buying on credit, that Americans go into debt in the 1920s in order to finance kind of various spending. And so because of that, that's going to create a bubble. It's eventually going to burst. People are going to be unable to pay back their loans. Americans also don't really have a lot of savings during this time. So when the Great Depression hits, a lot of Americans have no savings to fall back on. That's going to create a crisis. And then finally, stock market speculation is going to create instability. Buying stocks with loans, risky investments, but all of this stuff is going to hinge on the belief that the good times would never end. But unfortunately, despite all the roaring success of the 20s, the cultural instability and the economic instability is eventually going to end up in the 1930s in the